This is HOA Storytime Central, and the timeline is absurd. I moved to Park City, Utah 3 years ago for the mountains and the clean air, and I figured a gated community with an HOA would mean organized, drama-free living. I install security systems for a living, so I understand cameras, privacy laws, and how to document everything. The Autumn Ridge Association seemed fine at first, just the usual rules about lawn height and mailbox colors. But in a place where gray areas equal HOA power grabs, I learned fast that any project you start becomes a weapon they can use against you. I am in a custody and visitation routine with my ex-wife, and the HOA keeps targeting my schedule and my guests like they know exactly when to cause maximum chaos. The trouble started the morning I hired a contractor to replace my back fence. I was standing in my driveway with a tape measure and a folded plat map printout when Brenda Jackson pulled up in her white SUV and practically jumped out before the engine stopped. She is the Special Assessment Coordinator for the Autumn Ridge Association, which means she threatens sudden new charges whenever the board needs money. She had dark brown shoulder-length wavy hair, a pink cardigan, a white visor, and a keyring with too many keys jingling loudly on her belt loop. She marched straight over and pointed at the old cedar fence sagging along my property line. "You cannot just tear that down," she snapped. "You need written approval from the board, and you need a full survey with a licensed engineer signature, and you need to submit 3 contractor bids for review." I held up the plat map. "I have the survey scheduled for this afternoon. The contractor starts Monday. The fence is rotting and half the posts are cracked. I am replacing it with the exact same height and style." She crossed her arms. "I decide what counts as compliant, not you. If you proceed without approval, you will be cited for every day of construction, and I will bury you in notices until you run out of printer ink." That was the first time she said it, and I knew right then this was going to get ugly. I kept my voice calm. "The fence is on my property. The HOA rules say I can replace existing structures with like materials as long as I match the original specs. I am doing exactly that." She pulled out her phone and tapped something. "I am noting this conversation as a pre-violation warning. If I see any equipment or materials on this property before you receive written clearance, I will have your contractor vehicles cited or towed." I did not argue. I just nodded and walked back inside, and I called my contractor to give him a heads up. He laughed and said he had dealt with HOA power trips before, but I had a bad feeling this was going to be worse than usual. That afternoon, the surveyor showed up right on schedule and spent 2 hours running a string line, setting stakes, and taking measurements. I stood outside with him the whole time, making sure everything was documented. A mail carrier trying to get around tools and posts near the curb gave me a sympathetic look and said, "Good luck with that fence, buddy. This neighborhood loves a fight." By the time the surveyor finished, Brenda was back. She walked straight up to the string line and stared at the stakes like they personally offended her. She had a handheld radio clipped to her cardigan, and she lifted it and said something I could not quite hear. A moment later, a compliance officer in a golf cart rolled up. He was a retiree named Gary who took the job way too seriously. Brenda pointed at the stakes and said, "This survey was not approved in advance. I want it documented as a violation." Gary looked uncomfortable. "It is just a survey. They are allowed to measure their own property." She cut him off. "I want a record that they proceeded without clearance. Write it up." I stepped forward. "I have the surveyor report right here. It confirms the property line matches the county records and the original plat. The fence I am replacing is inside my boundary by 6 inches. There is no encroachment, no easement conflict, and no variance needed." Brenda turned to me with a tight smile. "I will need that report submitted to the board in triplicate. along with a written request for a compliance hearing. Until then, no construction. The surveyor packed up his equipment and handed me a folder with the full report, photos, and stamped drawings. He leaned in and whispered, "She is going to make this hell. Get everything in writing." That weekend, I got my first certified letter. It was 3 pages long, printed on Autumn Ridge Association letterhead, and it listed 6 separate violations: unapproved survey activity, unapproved contractor contact, failure to submit advance notice, failure to attend a pre-construction consultation, improper placement of survey markers, and creating a safety hazard by leaving stakes in the ground. Each violation carried a $50 daily fine starting the day the surveyor showed up. The letter said I had 5 business days to respond in writing, or the fines would escalate to $100 per day per violation. I sat at my kitchen table and did the math. If I did not respond, I would be looking at $300 a day in fines, and they could rack up thousands before I even got a hearing. I called an attorney that afternoon. She listened to the whole story and said, "This is harassment, but HOAs have a lot of leeway. You need to document everything, attend the hearing, and be ready to fight every single charge. If they are targeting your schedule because of your custody arrangement, that is retaliation, and we can use that." I spent Sunday drafting a 10-page response with photos, the surveyor report, county records, and a timeline showing I had followed every rule in the HOA handbook. I submitted it Monday morning by email and certified mail, and I got an auto reply saying my submission had been received and would be reviewed within 10 business days. My contractor was supposed to start that morning, but I called him and told him to hold off until I got clearance. He was frustrated, but he understood. Tuesday morning, I got another certified letter. This one said the board had reviewed my response and determined it was incomplete because I had not included proof of contractor licensing, proof of liability insurance, and a notarized statement that I would be personally liable for any damage to adjacent properties during construction. It also said that the original fines were still accruing because my response did not address the core compliance issue, which was that I had not received advance written approval. I was furious. I called the HOA management company and got transferred 3 times before I reached someone who could actually help. The woman on the phone sounded tired. "Look, I see your file. You followed the rules. But the board has discretion to require additional documentation if they believe there is a safety or aesthetic concern. You need to attend the next board meeting and make your case in person." The next board meeting was not for 2 weeks. By then, the fines would be over $8,000. I asked if I could request an emergency hearing, and she said I could submit a written request, but it would have to be approved by the board president. I hung up and immediately drafted the request, citing the escalating fines and the fact that my contractor was losing work while I waited. I sent it by email and certified mail, and I copied my attorney. Wednesday afternoon, I got a response. The board president denied my emergency hearing request and said I could address the issue at the regular meeting. The email also said that any further correspondence about this matter should go through the special assessment coordinator, which meant everything was going to funnel through Brenda. I felt the walls closing in. I had less than 2 weeks to figure out how to beat this, and every day I waited, the fines kept climbing. That evening, I called my neighbor Tom, who had been through his own HOA battle the year before. He sat near the front at meetings and recorded everything on his phone. He came over with a folder full of notes and recordings, and he said, "Brenda pulls this on everyone who does a big project. She waits until you are committed, then she buries you in paperwork and fines until you either give up or pay her off. The management company will not stop her because she brings in revenue. I asked him if he had any advice, and he said, "You need to catch her in a contradiction. Get her to make a claim on the record, then prove it is false. And you need witnesses." The board hates being embarrassed in public. I spent the next week gathering evidence. I reached out to 3 other neighbors who had dealt with Brenda and got written statements describing the same pattern: sudden rule changes, escalating fines, and refusal to accept documentation. One neighbor sent me same-day photos showing how Brenda had cited him for a fence repair that was identical to another property she had approved 2 months earlier. The photos had identical lighting and angles, and they made it obvious she was applying the rules selectively. I also got a certified statement from a former board member who had resigned in protest. The statement described Brenda's pattern and motive. She used compliance complaints to generate revenue, and she targeted homeowners who were less likely to fight back because of work schedules or family obligations. I did not mention my evidence yet, because I wanted her to repeat the story first. If she lied at the meeting, I could drop the proof and force the board to act. My attorney reviewed everything and said it was solid, but she warned me that Brenda might try to derail the meeting or cut my mic. She said, "You need to ask yes or no questions, get her on the record, then drop the document that contradicts her. Do not let her deflect." The Friday before the meeting, my contractor called and said he had another job lined up and could not wait any longer. I told him I understood, and I asked if he would be willing to write a short statement about the delays and the impact on his schedule. He agreed, and he sent me a 1-page letter on company letterhead. I added it to my evidence file. That weekend, I got another certified letter. This one said the board had scheduled my hearing for the regular meeting, but it also included a new charge: failure to maintain property aesthetics during the survey period. The letter said the survey stakes and string line were an eyesore and violated the community standards, and I was being fined $50 per day retroactive to the day the surveyor finished. I wanted to scream. The stakes had been in the ground for less than 2 weeks, and they were standard surveyor markers. But Brenda was using vague safety language, so neighbors assumed guilt without reading anything, and it was working. I saw 2 neighbors whispering and pointing at my yard, and one of them asked me if I was in some kind of legal trouble. Sunday afternoon, I was outside taking photos of the stakes and the string line when a sudden gust of wind hit. The string line popped loose from one of the stakes and whipped across the yard, snapping back with a loud crack. I grabbed it before it could tangle in the fence, and I was tying it back when Brenda appeared at the edge of my driveway. She had her handheld radio in one hand and her phone in the other, and she was recording me. "That line just snapped," she said loudly. "That is a safety hazard. I am documenting this as an additional violation." I looked at her. It was tied correctly. The wind pulled it loose. I am fixing it right now. She shook her head. "You should not have left it up this long. This is exactly why we require advance approval. Someone could have been hurt." A mail carrier walked by at that exact moment, and he stopped and said, "I was here when the surveyor put that up." It was fine. The wind just now pulled it. Brenda glared at him. "This does not concern you." He shrugged and kept walking, but I made a mental note to ask him for a statement later. Brenda turned back to me and said, "I will see you at the meeting. And just so you know, the board is considering a motion to require immediate removal of all survey equipment pending your hearing. If that passes, you will have 24 hours to clear your property or face a lien." She walked away before I could respond. I stood there holding the string line and realized she was escalating because she knew I was building a case. She wanted to overwhelm me before I could present my evidence. That night, I drafted an email to the board asking for the agenda and the right to speak during my hearing. I also asked for confirmation that I would be allowed to submit documents and call witnesses. I sent it Monday morning, and I got an auto reply. No human response. Tuesday, the management portal went down. I had planned to upload my evidence file electronically, but the system was offline and the error message said maintenance would take 2 to 3 business days. That meant I had to deliver paper proof in person today, or risk showing up to the meeting without the board having seen my documentation. I printed everything, put it in a binder, and drove to the management company office. The receptionist took the binder and said she would make sure it got to the board president, but she could not promise it would be reviewed before the meeting. I asked if I could get a receipt, and she printed one for me. I took a photo of it and emailed it to my attorney. She replied, "Good. If they claim they did not receive it, you have proof." Wednesday evening was the board meeting. I showed up 30 minutes early and found a seat in the front row. Tom was already there with his phone set up to record. He gave me a nod. Brenda arrived with 2 other board members, and she immediately started setting up a laptop and a projector. She had a stack of printed slides, and I could see my address on the top page. She was planning a full presentation. The meeting started with routine business, budget updates, landscaping bids, pool maintenance. Then the board president, a retired real estate broker named Mike, called my hearing. He said, "We have a compliance issue with Lot 42 regarding unauthorized survey activity and failure to obtain advance construction approval. Brenda will present the findings." Brenda stood up and clicked to the first slide. It was a photo of my property with the survey stakes circled in red. She said, "This homeowner proceeded with a survey and contractor coordination without submitting the required pre-approval form. The survey equipment has been in place for over 2 weeks, creating a visual blight and a potential trip hazard. In addition, the homeowner has been verbally combative with association staff and has attempted to bypass proper channels. If you are enjoying this story, hit that like button and subscribe for more HOA chaos." She clicked to the next slide, which was a timeline that made it look like I had ignored multiple warnings. Half the dates were wrong, and one of the warnings she referenced was a conversation that never happened. I raised my hand, and Mike said, "You will have a chance to respond after the presentation." Brenda continued, "The association has a duty to protect property values and ensure that all construction meets community standards. This homeowner has shown a pattern of disregard for the rules, and we recommend immediate removal of all survey equipment, a suspension of construction privileges for 6 months, and the imposition of all accrued fines, which currently total $9,400. The room went silent. A few neighbors in the back shifted uncomfortably. Tom was recording everything. Brenda sat down and folded her hands, looking smug. Mike turned to me and said, "You have 10 minutes to respond." I stood up and pulled out my binder. I started by walking through the timeline, correcting every wrong date and showing the board my certified mail receipts. I showed them the surveyor report, which confirmed the property line and noted that there were no encroachments. I showed them the contractor letter, which documented the delays and the financial impact. Then I showed them the neighbor statements and the photos proving selective enforcement. Brenda interrupted. "Those statements are hearsay. They are not relevant to your case." I ignored her and kept going. I pulled out the former board member's certified statement and read it aloud, making sure Tom's recording picked up every word. The statement described how Brenda routinely targeted homeowners with scheduling vulnerabilities, how she applied rules inconsistently to generate fine revenue, and how the management company had received multiple complaints but refused to act because the fines offset operational costs. Mike looked uncomfortable. He said, "That is a serious allegation. Do you have proof that the Special Assessment Coordinator acted improperly in your specific case? I nodded. I asked Brenda a question. Did you tell me on the day of the survey that you would bury me in notices until I ran out of printer ink? She hesitated. I said something to that effect, yes. But it was taken out of context. I pulled out my phone and played a voice memo. I had recorded the conversation that morning, and her exact words were clear. I will bury you in notices until you run out of printer ink. The room went dead quiet. Brenda's face turned red. I continued. You also told the compliance officer to write up a violation for a survey that is explicitly allowed under the HOA Handbook Section 4.3. You escalated fines on a retroactive basis for aesthetics that the handbook does not address. And you denied my emergency hearing request, even though the handbook says the board president has discretion to grant one for financial hardship. Every one of those actions violates the procedures you are supposed to follow. Mike cleared his throat. This is a lot to process. We will need to review your documentation and discuss this in executive session. I shook my head. No. I want this on the record tonight. I am requesting that the board vote to rescind all fines, approve my fence replacement as submitted, and issue a formal no-contact directive so that Brenda cannot retaliate. I am also requesting that the board commission an independent audit of all fines issued in the past 2 years to determine if there is a pattern of improper enforcement. Brenda stood up. This is ridiculous. You are trying to intimidate the board with threats and recordings. This homeowner has been hostile from day one, and he is using this hearing to grandstand. Tom spoke up from the front row. I have recordings of 3 other meetings where Brenda made similar threats. I can play them right now if you want. Mike held up his hand. That will not be necessary. We will take a 15-minute recess and reconvene. During the recess, I stood outside with Tom and my attorney, who had arrived halfway through the hearing. She said, "You did great. They are going to try to settle this quietly. Do not let them. Push for the audit." When the meeting reconvened, Mike read a prepared statement. The board has reviewed the evidence presented tonight and determined that there were procedural irregularities in the handling of this case. We are rescinding all fines related to the survey and construction delay, and we are approving the fence replacement as originally submitted. We are also directing the management company to schedule a third-party mediation session to address ongoing concerns about enforcement procedures. I interrupted. I want the audit. Mike looked at the other board members. They whispered for a moment, then he said, "The board agrees to mediation with a neutral third party to review compliance policies. If the mediator recommends an audit, we will comply." It was not everything I wanted, but it was enough to move forward. Brenda was staring at the table, her face still red. Mike continued. In addition, we are issuing a written directive that all future compliance matters involving Lot 42 will be handled by the management company directly, with no involvement from the Special Assessment Coordinator. That was my fine waiver in writing with a firm no-contact directive. I nodded. I accept those terms. The meeting ended, and several neighbors came up to thank me. One woman said she had been fighting Brenda for months over a mailbox color, and she was going to use my case as a precedent. Tom clapped me on the shoulder and said, "That recording was brilliant." She walked right into it. I drove home that night feeling cautiously optimistic. The fines were gone, the fence was approved, and Brenda could not touch me anymore. But I knew the fight was not over. The mediation was still ahead, and I had no idea if the board would actually follow through with an audit. I called my contractor and told him he could start Monday. He laughed and said, "I thought you were going to say that." I will have the crew there at 8. The next morning, I woke up to another certified letter. This one was from Brenda personally, not the board. It said, "I am formally requesting a reconsideration of last night's decision based on new information that has come to light." The letter did not specify what the new information was, but it was clear she was not done. I forwarded the letter to my attorney, and she called me an hour later. She said, "This is retaliation. Save that letter. If she keeps this up, we can file a complaint with the state regulatory board that oversees HOAs." Over the weekend, I prepped for construction. I called the city permit office to confirm I did not need a permit for a like-for-like fence replacement, and the clerk confirmed it. She also mentioned that Brenda had called earlier that week trying to argue that my fence required a variance because it was near a utility easement. The clerk said, "I told her the easement does not apply to your lot." She was not happy. Monday morning, the contractor crew showed up with a truck full of cedar panels, posts, and concrete mix. They started tearing out the old fence, and within an hour, the backyard looked like a construction zone. I stood outside with my small carpenter level tucked under one arm, checking the post placements and making sure everything matched the surveyor stakes. A neighbor across the street came over and said, "I heard about the meeting." Good for you. Brenda has been terrorizing this neighborhood for years. By midday, the crew had the first section of posts set in concrete. They were working fast, and I could tell they were relieved to finally be moving. The foreman said, "We will have this done in 3 days if the weather holds." That afternoon, Brenda showed up. She parked at the curb and walked straight onto my property without asking. She had her handheld radio and a clipboard, and she was taking notes. I walked over and said, "You are not allowed on my property." The board issued a no-contact directive. She did not look up. "I am conducting a compliance inspection. This is my job." I pulled out my phone and started recording. The board said all compliance matters go through the management company. You need to leave. She finally looked at me, and her face was twisted with anger. "You think you won, but you did not. I am going to find every code violation, every permit issue, every tiny mistake, and I am going to bury you. You will be paying fines until you sell this house." I kept recording. "You just threatened me on camera. I am sending this to my attorney and the board. You need to leave now, or I am calling the police." She turned and walked back to her car, but before she left, she yelled loud enough for the whole street to hear. "Your fence is going to fail inspection, and when it does, I will personally make sure you tear it down." The contractors stopped working and stared. The foreman walked over and said, "Is she always like that?" I nodded. "Pretty much." That evening, I sent the recording to my attorney and the board president. My attorney replied immediately, "This is textbook harassment. I am drafting a formal cease and desist letter, and I am recommending you file a complaint with the county." Tuesday morning, the fence crew finished the posts and started attaching the rails. The structure was taking shape, and it looked exactly like the old fence, just cleaner and stronger. I was standing in the yard checking the level when Tom walked over with a folder. He said, "I did some digging. Brenda has been running a community safety committee like a private police force with no authority. She has been telling people she can issue citations and call code enforcement, but none of it is actually legal. She is just making it up." I took the folder and flipped through it. It was full of printed emails and meeting notes showing how Brenda had positioned herself as the compliance enforcer, even though the HOA handbook said all enforcement had to go through the management company. Tom said, If you bring this up at the mediation, the board is going to have to act. Wednesday, the fence was nearly finished. The crew was hammering in the last pickets when a city code inspector pulled up. He said he had received a complaint about unpermitted construction, and he needed to verify that the fence met setback and height requirements. I walked him around the property, showed him the surveyor report, and explained that it was a like-for-like replacement. He took some measurements, checked his notes, and said, "Everything looks good. You are fine." I asked him who filed the complaint, and he said it was anonymous, but the caller had mentioned the HOA. I thanked him, and he left. The foreman said, "That was Brenda, was not it?" Definitely. Thursday afternoon, the fence was done. It looked perfect, matching the original height and style, and it was solid enough to last another 20 years. I stood in the backyard and took photos from every angle, just in case Brenda tried to claim something was wrong. The contractor foreman handed me a completion certificate and said, "Good luck with your HOA. You are going to need it." That evening, I got a call from the mediator. She said the first mediation session was scheduled for the following Monday, and both the board and I would be required to submit written statements in advance. She also said that Brenda had requested to attend, but the mediator had denied her request because she was a party to the dispute. I felt a small surge of relief. At least I would not have to deal with her directly. I spent the weekend drafting my statement. I included the timeline, the evidence, the recordings, and Tom's research about the Illegal Compliance Committee. I also included the contractor delays, the financial impact, and the stress on my custody schedule. My attorney reviewed it and said, "This is strong." The mediator is going to see exactly what has been happening. Monday morning, I arrived at the mediation office and found Mike and one other board member waiting in the lobby. Brenda was not there, but the tension was obvious. The mediator called us into a conference room and said, "I have reviewed all the submitted materials, and I want to start by addressing the procedural issues. It is clear that enforcement has been inconsistent and that the Special Assessment Coordinator has overstepped her authority on multiple occasions. The question now is how the board plans to correct this." Mike said, "We are committed to improving our policies. We are willing to implement new oversight procedures and provide training to all compliance staff." The mediator turned to me. "What outcome are you seeking?" I said, "I want an independent audit of all fines issued in the past 2 years. I want a written policy that requires the management company to handle all enforcement, with no involvement from individual board members. And I want Brenda removed from any role that involves compliance or homeowner contact." Mike shifted in his chair. Removing a board member is not something we can do lightly. I pulled out the folder Tom had given me and slid it across the table. This shows how she has been running an unauthorized committee and making enforcement decisions that violate your own handbook. If you do not act, I will file a formal complaint with the state, and I will encourage every homeowner she has targeted to do the same. The mediator picked up the folder and skimmed through it. She said, "These are serious allegations. I am recommending that the board commission the audit and revise the enforcement policy immediately. I am also recommending that the Special Assessment Coordinator role be restructured to remove direct homeowner contact." Mike looked at the other board member, and they nodded. He said, "We accept those recommendations." The mediator continued, "In addition, I am recommending that the board issue a formal written apology to this homeowner and provide a full refund of any costs incurred during the improper enforcement, including contractor delays and legal fees." I had not expected that, but I was not going to argue. Mike agreed, and the mediator said she would draft the settlement agreement and send it to all parties within 48 hours. The meeting ended, and I walked out feeling like I had finally won. 2 days later, I received the settlement agreement. It included everything the mediator had promised: the audit, the policy revisions, the apology, and the refund. It also included a clause requiring Brenda to retract her claim in writing and confirming that she would have no further involvement in compliance matters. I signed it and sent it back. A week later, the audit results came back. The independent auditor found improper late fees tied to notices, inconsistent application of rules, and insufficient documentation for over 60% of the fines issued in the past 2 years. The report recommended that the HOA refund a large batch of charges across the neighborhood and implement a new oversight process. The board voted to accept the findings and issued refund checks to every affected homeowner. The total came to over $40,000. Brenda resigned from the board the day after the audit was published. She sent a short email saying she was stepping down for personal reasons, but everyone knew why. Tom called me that evening and said, "You did it. You actually did it." I stood in my backyard looking at the new fence and felt a sense of calm I had not felt in months. The custody schedule was back on track, the HOA was off my back, and Brenda was gone. It was not perfect, but it was over. And Karen says it is about safety, and the insurer email says stop became a running joke in the neighborhood, because someone found an old email where Brenda had claimed a compliance issue was about insurance liability, but the actual insurer had replied telling her to stop filing frivolous claims. The neighborhood slowly started to relax. People stopped whispering about violations and started talking about normal things like block parties and holiday lights. Tom organized a neighborhood meeting to discuss the new enforcement policies, and over 30 people showed up. It was the most engaged the community had been in years. A few months later, I ran into the mail carrier who had witnessed the string line incident. He said, "I heard what happened. That was something. You stood up to her, and now everyone feels safer." I thanked him, and he said, "If you ever run for the board, you have got my vote." I laughed, but part of me wondered if that was the next step. For now, though, I was happy to just enjoy my backyard and my solid fence. I had learned that in a place where gray areas equal HOA power grabs, the only way to survive is to document everything, stand your ground, and never let them intimidate you into silence. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.